Welcome, everybody, to a special edition of the Grueling Truth Sports Network. And today we're going to count down the top 10 sports moments of the past decade. I'm your host for the show, Mike Goodpaster, and my co-host is Lucas Weese. How you doing, Lucas?
I'm doing well, Mike. It's great to be on the show with you again. I know last week we talked about the top 10 moments of the year, but it's fascinating this past decade in sports. So I'm looking forward to seeing the similarities of our lists, and I'm sure a lot of differences.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, nothing from last year made my list. I know you probably got that Raptor crap, but
Well, we'll see. I mean,
and if
the
that's
great thing
number
about it,
one, this show's never going to be played again because it can't be, Lucas. I didn't list my top 10 sports
yeah,
moment with all my team's great accomplishments, but of course
nope,
there are none.
that's true.
Well, Xavier made the Elite
That
Eight like three
that is
times.
true.
Xavier making the Elite Eight three
Yeah.
times is about it for me. But let's go ahead and let's start off with number 10, Lucas.
My number 10, so basically, just before I go into the list, I split it up by basically ranking from 10 to 6 are newsmakers or stories or concepts that really stood out in this decade. And then 5 through 1 are actual, real, moments on the field that really captivate, where you put in any year, they're going to be great moments. So my number 10 is the discussion about hockey culture. I know it's very recent. I know that it has really occurred the last few months, particularly here in Canada, with the firing of Don Cherry, the firing of Calgary Flames coach Bill Peters, and just a general conversation about where the game is going and how the game, I think, needs to be more inclusive, accepting, etc., particularly with a lot more former players speaking out about their experiences in hockey locker rooms. And I think why it's at number 10 is it's just so recent that we don't really know where this story is going. I know that Commissioner Gary Bettman of the NHL made a statement saying that he's very interested in really tackling this issue head on with a new policy in place to vet coaches before they come into
Hey, real quick,
team
I've
or,
got a
or, or, or an
question.
organization.
I've got a Twitter question from Malcolm, who is in, it looks like Alabama, and he wants to know what in the hell Lucas is talking about with hockey culture.
Well, it's a big
The stupid
story.
American.
And yeah, pretty much that. And who's pissed off that the Crimson Tide are who
Yeah.
has two losses and aren't in the college football playoff.
Malcolm is an
But I think,
Auburn fan, by the way, so he's plenty happy
okay,
with Alabama not being
he's
in.
happy,
But go ahead.
but they're still not. But Auburn's still not in the Final Four. But anyway, back to number 10. I just think that with hockey culture, I think it's a conversation that is going to continue into the next decade. So that's why it's my number 10, because I think to have big names and personalities like Don Cherry getting fired and top head coaches getting fired for previous actions, I think warrants a lot of news, and it's certainly captivating news here in Canada.
So, what's your take on the hockey culture situation and guys like Don Cherry getting fired?
Well, I think my take is, aside from what Don Cherry had to say, I think Don Cherry was past his prime, to be honest with you.
Well, yeah, he's like 90 years old. Everybody's past their prime then. But Don Cherry had a history of being past his prime then, even if you go back to his younger days.
I think so. And I think one colleague who I respect very much here said that, Don Cherry became bigger than Hockey Night in Canada itself. And I think that posed a lot of concerns, and they figured out a time when to cut the cord, and they did it this year. But I think that, but if I may finish, I think that more so than Don Cherry, I think Bill Peters getting fired for racial slurs in the locker room, that I think with Akeem Alou, the former player, tweeting about it, and the NHL doing its investigation and really tackling this issue head on with looking to adapt the policy to vet future coaches, I think is a big step forward. But who knows how it will be adapted, how it will look like. But hockey is a problem at the institutional level, and I think that it's come to the forefront now. But especially minor and junior hockey, which I cover, where the spotlight isn't as big on the sport, that's where the culture really needs to be changed.
Yeah, I've seen some. I saw something. I don't even remember what it was on, like a week ago, about that and the hazing that goes on in minor league or junior hockey up there, and it was actually kind of scary. And Don Cherry then would be kind of the equivalent of Howard Cosell with Monday Night Football.
Very much so.
So, because you had the little monkey comments about Darryl Green, which were, I think, just a reason to usher him to the door because they wanted him out the door. Because when you look back, he had said the same thing about Mike Adamle in a college all-star game, 10 years before, and he called his grandkids that. So I think a lot of times it's just they were looking for a reason to get rid of him, too.
Absolutely.
So, all right, my number 10 is a combination, and it would be Colin Kaepernick and the CTE issue, because I think all of this brings to light the hypocrisy of the NFL. With Kaepernick, what do you think, he's wrong or he's right? I mean, the NFL could have taken care of this by doing what the NBA did in, 96, 99, right around there, where they made it mandatory that you couldn't take a knee or leave the field before the national anthem. And also, I think it really calls to light that Colin Kaepernick never gets a chance to play football again. But you guys that beat on their wives and beat on their kids and do all sort of heinous stuff, and they do get another chance. And I just think that the CTE with Mike Webster and the fact that until you get a movie made, Concussion, what was that, around mid-decade, around 2013, 14, somewhere around there, that they were still claiming, and they were still paying doctors off to say that CTE could not be caused because of football. And I think that it's just a big corporation that got called to light on this, and they act like they're doing stuff positive, but then you get the Colin Kaepernick thing, and you see that really they're just out for their own best interest.
For sure, and they're out to protect their bottom line, and these owners don't want anything to do with someone like a Colin Kaepernick who may impact the bottom line, the ticket sales, the merchandise sales, etc. When there really is no evidence that, there isn't really any concrete evidence to suggest that could be impacted. So it's just, I think, they're trying to create that narrative to scare people and whatnot, but really it's like you say, Mike, I just think it's just the owners using their power and their financial influence to supplant a guy who's just out there sending a message about the hypocrisy of the NFL and unarmed police brutality on black men in the United States.
Yeah. And really, there's plenty of police brutality on white people now, too. Just go to YouTube
True.
and YouTube it.
True.
We'll get off that now because Billy Bob in Kentucky is probably getting ready to turn the show off. Number 9, I've got Super Bowl 49. And the reason I have that is this. Number 1 is the game that's tied at the half. And this is the game that really establishes Tom Brady's greatness to me because that Seattle Seahawks team, I think, had the greatest defense in NFL history. And the reason I say that is the way the rules have been changed, it makes it to be the dominating, steel curtain of the mid-'70s or the monsters of the midway of the mid-'80s. And this team was shutting people down, and they go up 24-14, and Tom Brady goes the length of the field twice to take the lead. And Seattle comes back, gets the ball down to the 1-yard line. They decide to throw the ball. It gets intercepted by Malcolm Butler. But there's so many things in this game that stood out to me, from Brady's comeback to how well Russell Wilson played when he was considered to be just a guy that was being drug along by his defense, the coaching mistake or non-mistake of Pete Carroll. I could see it either way, actually, and the brilliance of Bill Belichick, because I don't think his team was as good as Seattle's.
It was, to me, the Super Bowl of the decade. we were ranking all the Super Bowls, that definitely to me was the top game. And I think a moment, Mike, that gets sort of as a footnote now because of how it ended was Jermaine Kearse's unbelievable catch just a few plays before the Malcolm Butler interception. If the Seahawks win that game, we're talking about that Jermaine Kearse moment.
Yeah. And I don't know. I would find it hard to judge what I think was the best Super Bowl of the decade because it's one of the few decades we've had where there was multiple great football games.
That's true. And generally, the Super Bowls that were great this decade involved the Patriots. So, but I just think you had two really great teams on the field. I think the compelling narrative of, the Patriots coming into that game, Deflategate behind them. The Seahawks are trying to win back-to-back Super Bowls. And then, it gets defined, by Brady's brilliance in the fourth quarter, plus whether or not to run Marshawn Lynch at the 1-yard line.
Yeah. Which I can see why he didn't. I just think it was a bad call. But I think also we saw the brilliance of Bill Belichick there.
To sub in Malcolm Butler.
Yeah, and he knew the play was coming. They told him what to do. They told him what was going to happen, and he did it. It happened, and they won the game. All right, what do you got at number 9?
My number 9 is the Golden State Warriors dynasty. And this, to me, was the second best dynasty of this decade. And, if you look at the first half of this decade, the Warriors were a laughingstock. But smart ownership by building through the draft. They drafted Steph Curry out of Davidson, Klay Thompson, Draymond Green. They got rid of Mark Jackson to bring in Steve Kerr. And all of a sudden, the winning culture of this team started to form. And they win an NBA championship in 2015 for the first time. In 2016, they break the regular season record with 73 wins. They make the finals but lose in 7 to the Cavs. 2017, they get Kevin Durant, who at that time was one of the best players, if not the best player in the NBA. In the 2017 NBA playoffs, they go 16-1, which is just off the charts amazing. Durant gets back-to-back MVPs as the Warriors win in 2017 and 2018. This team from 2015 onward was the best team in the NBA. Now, I think they're the second best dynasty of this decade because the way the rules work in the NBA, I just think, you can build a super team, and that's what they did by getting Kevin Durant. But they were exciting. They were exciting on the court with the Splash Brothers, Steph Curry, Klay Thompson, really revolutionizing three-point shooting in the NBA. And these players also were big off the court as well, which is increasing their brands around the world. I think Steph Curry was certainly one to be, a big global ambassador for basketball and very involved in his business venture. So I think for the Golden State Warriors, they were the dynasty of basketball this decade. They won 3 championships. They made 5 straight finals. So they're my number 9 story.
All right, I went a different way because my number 8 is the year the Cavs beat them. Because number 1, the Cavs are in Cleveland, which haven't won anything since, Frank Ryan in 1964 with the Cleveland Browns, or 65? I think it was 64. But they hadn't won anything. They lost the World Series, I think that same year, wasn't it, 2016? And you had maybe the greatest defensive play, the most important in a Game 7 history, with LeBron James's blocking and Kyrie Irving hitting the 3. And the Warriors, I don't have on the list, but it's just because there's only 10 and a lot of stuff happened. But the thing that stands out to me with the Warriors is I don't think the Warriors ever bought a super team. They just added a player. Everybody else was pretty much drafted, correct?
No, that is true. I think where I make that point is unlike, another dynasty, unlike, let's say, the Patriots or the San Francisco Giants, who won 3 World Series in 5 years, where they had, not as good a talent as Golden State did. Golden State, through the purview of the rules, were able to recruit a really top player who they beat the year before. And I think, from a court of public opinion, it's why I think the Warriors became the team that no one really liked, was because they, were able to recruit a guy like Kevin Durant on an already amazing team, and then they just sort of skewed the parity of basketball. Now, the good for them, it was through the purview, and they succeeded and became a real great dynasty of this decade. But, there have been other dynasties in basketball, right? And whereas in other sports, it's not as common. So that's why I put them in number 9. I mean, they were an amazing dynasty. They were the best basketball dynasty, but I just think there are better stories ahead of them.
All right.
Go ahead, Mike.
Who do you got at number 8?
My number 8 is the Colin Kaepernick anthem protest. And you outlined a lot of those reasons. I just think for me, what I'll just inject is this story had legs for the last couple of years. Like, normally stories, they happen, they captivate a year.
Yeah.
But we're still talking about Colin Kaepernick 3 years, right?
It is probably not done yet.
Colin Kaepernick, and you're absolutely right. And with Colin Kaepernick and his workout this year and all that element to the story, it makes it very interesting. But I think what we need to keep in mind, what this story did was, I think, more attention was paid onto the oppression that African Americans face with police brutality. That was the initial purpose of Colin Kaepernick's protest. It certainly got the President of the United States to talk, and that led to other teams starting to protest because of what the president had to say. But I think you hit the nail on the head, Mike. This is an issue that could have been prevented if the players and the owners had agreed in the collective bargaining agreement to just say, you're not allowed to protest the national anthem. And I think what it's led to, though, which I think is a positive thing, is just a lot more conversation between African-American players, the NFL, and communities to try to really raise awareness and invest resources to combat the issues that Colin Kaepernick was protesting for. And as we saw with this workout stunt that he did, I just think he is more interested in being a martyr for social justice than he is in actually playing, which I don't fault him for.
Yeah, but I think he would have a bigger effect if he came back, played, and was successful.
Exactly, right? So it's a very complex issue, but I think it was one that certainly captured sports, the news for, as you said, 3 years. So it's my number 8 story.
Well, and the bad thing is the American public's not smart enough to realize that it's not racism anymore. It's more of a haves and have-nots. And if you're a poor person, you're going to be treated like crap. If you're a rich person, more than likely you're going to be left alone. My number 7 is 2010 Olympic hockey, Canada versus the U.S. The wrong team win because the bad guys from Canada won. But this is something that, and I'll tell you, with Olympic hockey, still captivates me just because of what I personally saw in 1980. So I always watch this. It's not as good anymore because, the Russians aren't communist and, Ivan Drago's no longer a heavyweight boxer. Wait, that wasn't true anyways. But the thing that stood out to me here is it's in Canada. And if I remember right, the U.S. beat Canada in the Group A regular session, the last game 5-3. And when you go to the medal round, which is not really a medal round anymore, it's the top 12 seeds or so. But the Canadians crushed Germany. They crushed Russia. They beat Slovakia, who was really good that year, 3-2. The U.S. beat Switzerland, and then they crushed Finland 6-1. And this was a great game that, like I said, I didn't get to do a lot of research before this show, but if I remember right, the U.S. tied this game in like the last minute to send it to overtime, and then Canada won it in the overtime, Lucas.
It's an amazing moment that is much higher on my list, but I'm glad that
you're Canadian and you won. I'm an American and we lost.
But I'm glad you still recognize it as a top moment.
Oh, yeah, it's one of my favorites.
Some Americans I know are very bitter.
Well, put it like this. If we were doing a show from 1980 to 1990, My number one would be the 80 Olympic hockey gold medal game. Now, that would probably still make your top 10 as a Canadian just because we all hated the Russians, but it's probably going to fall somewhere between 5 and 10.
It would be my top 5 of the 80s.
Okay, but it wouldn't be number one because you'd probably have Warren Moon winning his 5th Grey Cup.
No, I don't. Well, yeah, maybe the 49ers beating your Bengals, Mike.
Hey,
hey,
which time? That could have been in there twice. All right, Lucas.
The John Candy game. The John Candy game.
Lucas, I don't want to hear about that crap. I already told you that. I mean, I'd hate to have to hang up and cancel the show. Let's see. What are we at? Your number 7?
Yes. My number 7 is the New England Patriots dynasty. Now, I know that you mentioned a Super Bowl, but I'm just, extending the concept because this was the best dynasty of the decade, maybe in all of sports in the 21st century. The New England Patriots won the AFC East every single decade that was played in the National Football League. That's incredible. They only missed 2 AFC championships in that time in 2010 and 2011. They've made every single AFC championship since. They made Super Bowls in the 2011 season, and then the Super Bowl 49, Super Bowl 51, Super Bowl 52, and Super Bowl 53. They've won 3 Super Bowls in that span, and I just think extending on what Super Bowl 49 was, the greatness of Bill Belichick and Tom Brady were once again personified in all 5 of those Super Bowls. They could have won against the New York Giants if it weren't for Eli Manning throwing to Mario Manningham and another miracle drive, or Wes Welker dropping that ball earlier in the 4th quarter. They could have beaten the Philadelphia Eagles if it weren't for the Philly special or that strip fumble by Graham. And the games in which they won, we talked about Super Bowl 49. They come back 28-3 down against the Atlanta Falcons to beat them in overtime, the first Super Bowl that went to sudden death overtime. And in the lowest scoring Super Bowl in the history of the big game, they beat Wade Phillips and the Los Angeles Rams 13-3. So they found different ways to win. They used different personnel. But the 2 guys that remain were Tom Brady and Bill Belichick. And they just showed why this is the best dynasty of this decade and maybe in all of sports. So they're my number 7.
All right. My number 6 is the University of Maryland at Baltimore County. Actually, just so you know, my next 3 are all college basketball, March Madness, because I still think it's the greatest sports tournament. But no number 16 had ever beaten a number 1. They'd been close a few times. You remember the old Princeton, Georgetown, East Tennessee State against Oklahoma. And they were 20.5-point favorites. Nobody gave them a chance. And it wasn't just that they won this game. It was the fact that they won this game like 74-54, if I remember right. And basically, people would just not even consider the 16 versus the 1 even being a competitive game. And I think this changed that forever. But I think just the fact that since they've had 16 seeds, which was 1985, you've had 4 attempts every year for over 30 years, and nobody has ever done it. So, and I love an actual true Cinderella story, which you can usually only get in college sports. And this would be my number 6.
It was, to me, the defining moment of the NCAA tournament in this decade, I would say.
I've got 2 more that I like better, and those will be my next 2.
Looking forward to hearing them, Mike.
All right, what do you got at 6?
I got the Humboldt Broncos bus crash. And, I thought a lot about it and whether I should include it in the top 10 moments of the decade, but we talked a lot about it last year when we did this show.
It was my number 1 last year. Tyler Skaggs was my number 1 this year. I didn't put him in now because I just wanted kind of more positive moments for the show.
And for me, there will be from 5 through 1. But given that I am from Canada and I just think what was really positive about it was just how the country came together. And I said it back last year. I think what was so brilliant was the community of Humboldt really opened its doors to a lot of media and TV networks, which they didn't have to do. But I think the media really in Canada presented it in a poignant way that really empathized with the families and really ensured that these stories of these people who passed away and still survived but were so traumatized were told in a very appropriate, humane way. And to have over $5 million being donated to the GoFundMe page that would then be given to the families for support, to have a ceremony that was nationally televised where in the Humboldt Arena all the jerseys of all the players are retired, and to see everyone in the hockey community, whether it was putting a stick in front of your house or wearing the green and yellow ribbons, I think we all became part of this story. And I think it really spoke to me in a lot of ways because, you know, as young kids, anyone who does hockey in this country, just riding the bus is such a thing you take for granted because it's, you know, that's how you get from point A to point B to different arenas. And to have that taken away was so sad. And from the legal perspective, the driver actually got, you know, charged and, you know, is going, getting sentenced for doing that because of reckless driving. So, you know, sad story, of course. I think, you know, so many, you know, there were a lot of tragedies in this decade that occurred in the backdrop of sports, but I think what stood out for Humboldt was how the whole country came together to support this community. And really, I think it's, you know, still talked about, I think, you know, years after and will be for decades to come.
Yeah, and I think that it's, you know, you've seen the movie We Are Marshall, the Marshall plane crash, the University of Evansville plane crash in 1977, Wichita State football team plane crash in 1970. And, I mean, luckily it's something that doesn't happen very often, but it does happen. And, I mean, it's just terrible to think about those families and the loss that they had. My number 5 is the 2018 Loyola Ramblers run to the Final Four. And the thing that impressed me about that is this is a team that the Missouri Valley Conference Tournament, I'm about the only person that watches it, and that's because Indiana State, where I went to school, plays in it every year. And Loyola almost lost in the first round of the Missouri Valley Conference Tournament to Northern Iowa. They ended up winning 54-50. They squeaked by Bradley. Then they blew out Illinois State. And then you get tournament time. They beat Miami at the buzzer by 2, Tennessee at the buzzer by a point, Nevada at the buzzer by a point. Then they blow out Kansas State, and next thing you know, they are in the Final Four. The only run that I think would compare to it would be Virginia Commonwealth in 2011, who actually even had to play a first 4 game. But I just think this was a great story. And to watch them win 3 buzzer beaters in a row to get to the Elite 8 and then eventually to the Final Four, where I think people forget they had to lead early in the first half there and looked like they might pull this off again. But I think the Loyola Ramblers belong on this list.
And don't forget about Sister Jean, Mike. She was quite
I'm not Catholic. I don't care about Sister Jean. I was like the basketball part of it.
Well, it was a great, you know, it was a great person who really embodied that program as well as the
But I couldn't remember her name. I didn't want to just say that sister.
It's true.
All right. So what do you got at number 5?
My number 5 is Tiger Woods' Masters win this year. We spoke about it last week when I mentioned it in my top 10 moments of 2019, but I think why this is one of the top moments of the decade was just how, you know, in terms of individual sports, no one dominated the conversation more than Tiger Woods, who didn't actually play all that much. He was injured a lot, dealing with a lot of personal issues. 2017, the Masters Championship dinner, he's saying to fellow Masters champions, I don't think I can play anymore. And, you know, he had one last emergency back surgery. And then in 2018, he played a lot. He won the Tour Championship. And the Masters in 2019, it all came together for him to win his first major championship since 2008. And I think, whatever you say about the man, you had a lot of self-inflicted character flaws. I think his ability to come back from his physical issues to be able to win a major championship at the highest level at Augusta National to win the Masters, where many golf fans think it is the top major tournament in the sport. So I think in addition to him winning the Masters, I just think it's been a whole decade of just year after year. Is Tiger done? Is he back? And then it crescendo to him in 2019, finally able to do it. And just the scene at Augusta National with his family and him finally putting on the green jacket is something that I won't forget. And I think it'll definitely, for the sport of golf, define this decade.
Okay, it's not a sport, but it's not as bad as NASCAR, so I'll let it go. And I know it's a big deal, but I'm just not a huge golf fan. I didn't watch
That's okay.
it. I had people texting me about it, but not a big deal to me. But that's fine. It's a big deal to you, as long as it's not auto racing. All right, number 4, 2016 NCAA final. And the reason I say that is this. Because whenever we see a great game, we always have a tendency to say that was the greatest one we've ever seen. And I saw this, and I was getting ready to write an article on the 10 greatest NBA, or I already written an article on the 10 best NCAA championship games in history. And I started thinking about that and how people will just call the latest the greatest. And after the game was over, I immediately watched the game again. And I'm watching it, I'm thinking, this is the best NCAA championship game I've ever seen. And you had the Marcus Page and the Chris Jenkins shot back-to-back. Jenkins wins it at the buzzer for Villanova over North Carolina. But the thing that stood out to me, lead changed 11 times, and Villanova averaged 1.2 points per possession. North Carolina averaged 1.15. I mean, this game was played officially on the offensive end. It was well played on the defensive end. You had two big-time coaches going against each other. And to me, it may be the greatest college basketball game I've ever seen.
It was incredible. And, I'm, as you know, I'm a Tar Heel fan, so it was a little painful at the end. But it still was just incredible drama, and I think it exemplified what the NCAA tournament is all about. And not every day you get to see a buzzer beater in the national championship game. I think that also, too, is
Well, it was
pretty
almost
remarkable.
like two buzzer beaters, because you remember
Exactly.
Page's shot was like with a second and a half left, it goes down, and then Jenkins hits the shot. I mean, it was just an amazing basketball game. Plus, I picked Villanova to win, and I was told I was nuts, and I might have made a little bit of money.
Good for you, Mike.
Which never hurts either. All right, what do you got at number 4? 4.
Yeah. My number 4 is LeBron James leading the Cleveland Cavaliers to its first NBA championship since 1964. And I think, again, why this moment stands out for me is just what the decade has, had been leading up to that point for LeBron James. In 2010, he bows out of Cleveland. He leaves with that infamous Decision ESPN TV show to the Miami Heat. He finally goes and wins 2 championships with the Heat, but then he makes a decision to leave that situation to come back to Cleveland, a place where a lot of fans, lost their respect for LeBron for leaving. He definitely didn't have the best relationships with the ownership, but he had to come back and try to embrace his home. And I think coming home for athletes, sometimes gets overlooked, but it's so special, particularly, the upbringing that LeBron had, which wasn't the greatest. And for able to come back to Cleveland on a team with Kyrie Irving, Kevin Love, and lead them to an NBA championship. And that's, taking on the Golden State Warriors. This is a team that had won 73 games. They were, many people calling the greatest regular season team of all time in NBA history. And they were down 3-1 in the NBA Finals. And LeBron James in Game 5 scores 41 points. In Game 6, he puts up 41 points. And then in Game 7, he puts up a triple-double where he scores 27 points, 11 rebounds, 11 assists to beat the Golden State Warriors in 7 games. And I don't know if you remember that game, Mike, that Game 7 with LeBron blocking Iguodala's layup and then Kyrie Irving hitting the dagger.
I know.
three.
I just went through this at number 9.
And well, just remind those who are just tuning in.
I know. I'm just kidding.
It was a fantastic game, and I just think for LeBron, it was the greatest win of his career, and it was his last NBA championship he's won. But I think when you look back and just the team that he had and being able to dethrone the Golden State Warriors the way they did, and being the only team in NBA history to come back from 3-1 in the NBA Finals to win, it's an unbelievable sports moment. And it was just an unbelievable single achievement from LeBron to bring a championship to his home.
All right. What do you got at number 3?
Number 3, I have the Toronto Raptors winning the NBA championship. They're not my number 1.
I know it's your number 1, really, but you didn't want me to give you crap about it. Go ahead.
And but I talked about what that championship meant to me last week. But I just think if you look at the decade of the Raptors before 2019, and certainly in the first half of the decade, the laughingstock narrative of the Raptors was ever apparent. In 2010, they were coached by Jay Triano, and they were finished 40-44. But I think the whole concept of the Raptors changed when they hired Masai Ujiri to be the president of basketball operations. And I think when they did that, they rebranded their team as We the North. The Northern Uprising has begun. And the Raptors became, had that more edgy, hip look to them as a team. And they got Kyle Lowry in a trade. They were able to acquire DeMar DeRozan. And all of a sudden, the Raptors started to make the playoffs. And the fan base started to really rally behind this team. And then it obviously accelerated all the way to the championship when they got Kawhi Leonard. And they win the championship in dramatic fashion, beating the Golden State Warriors. They're my number 3 because I think, again, how does this help the Canada basketball? It certainly helped in the short term, a lot more popularity. But I think we're going to see in the next decade, if Masai Ujiri stays in Toronto, can he do something like this again? Can he lure a top free agent to go to Toronto now knowing that they have built a winning culture there and they can win a championship? So it's my number 3 moment. I think, I spoke about it at length last week about the personal aspect of it. But I think from where they started this decade, finishing the season below 500 to being a consistent playoff team to then finally winning the championship, I think it's just a great improvement story that have now launched the Raptors on the NBA map.
All right. My number 3 is Super Bowl 42. And I think it was the greatest Super Bowl game I've seen. Maybe. I don't know. It's up there. But the fact that I think this is the biggest upset in Super Bowl history, and don't give me the Super Bowl 3, because if you look back at that and you look at the rosters on those 2 teams, you wonder how in the hell anybody can make, you could make the Colts the favorite, but not by almost 3 touchdowns. This was a Patriots team that was undefeated. They had Tom Brady. They had Randy Moss. The Giants basically had a unrelenting pass rush in this game. O.C. Umenyiora, Michael Strahan, Barry Cofield, Fred Robbins. And all of them, they sacked a total of Tom Brady 5 times. And David Tyree came down with one of the greatest catches of all time. And I just think that it's hard to top this game and all the ramifications, because could you imagine right now if the Patriots had an undefeated season on this run and another Super Bowl championship?
It was an unbelievable moment, Mike, but I'm going to point out to you, it actually occurred in 2008.
No, did it? Well, whatever. I
Sorry,
told you I was
Mike.
going off the top of my head.
But I mean, it was an unbelievable moment that I think,
All right, my number 3 was the New England Patriots beating the Atlanta Falcons down 28-3 with 17 minutes left in the game. How about that one?
That's good. That's good.
Man.
But yeah, no, both those games were incredible. But I just thought I'd point it out for accuracy.
Yeah, whatever. It seemed like it wasn't that long ago to me. But all right, what do you got at number 2?
My number 2 is the Chicago Cubs World Series victory, and the history of this team has been one of failure and disappointment. And it stems all the way back to the curse of the Billy Goat, and that curse where the Billy Goat couldn't be allowed at Wrigley Field, and that Billy Goat owner said that the Cubs will never win the World Series again. And years after years of just disappointment and Steve Bartman foul ball incident and more years of disappointment. Like, the crazy thing about this, Mike, is there were people who lived and died never seeing their team win because it was that long. It was over 100 years before they were able to win the World Series. In 2016, it finally happened. They faced the Cleveland Indians team that also hadn't won a World Series since 1948. The Cubs were down 3-1. They bring it back to Game 7. And that Game 7 of the World Series is one of the best Game 7s, I think, in my lifetime.
Yeah, because this is my number 2. So I just figure we'll carry it together since it's both our number 2s. And the thing I remember about that was, number 1, they were down 3-2 going to Cleveland, had to win Game 6. And then Game 7, if I remember right, weren't they down like 5-1?
No.
Or up 5-1. Yeah, and Cleveland tied them. Yeah.
Yeah, and then Rajay Davis in the 8th inning got a 2-run homer to send the game to extra innings. And what was dramatic about it was there was a rain delay even in that. And it was Ben Zobrist who got the game-winning RBI. And then Chris Bryant made a slow roller play from third base, threw it to first to give the Cubs, for the first time in over 100 years, the World Series championship. And just to see the images of Chicago that night and the days after were just so incredible. And it just was all, what sports were all about for a team and a fan base that had just, and like I said, there were people that went through their whole lives never seen this team finally win. I think the sort of equivalent now would be the Toronto Maple Leafs for Torontonians, but nothing like for, Chicago residents cheering for the Cubs.
Do they really call Toronto residents Torontonians?
Yes.
I never knew that.
They do.
How about Torontoans? We could change it. John Candy people?
Yeah. But the Chicago Cubs, it's an unbelievable story. And, a really great team to finally break the curse.
Yeah, and to think of that, from 1906 to 110 years later to win it. And I think in 1945, they lost to the Tigers in 7. You had 1969, the meltdown against the New York Mets, where they had, a 9 or 10 game lead at the end of August. 1984, when they were up 2-0 against the Padres and lose the last 3, including blowing a lead in Game 5, where the ball went between Leon Durham's legs, wasn't it, at first base?
Yes.
Yeah, and Lee Smith was the closer that lost the game. Yeah, 2003, they were up, 3-1 on the Marlins?
Yep, and then the whole Steve Bartman thing.
Oh, Steve Bartman had nothing to do with that.
The black cat on the diamond. I mean, this is,
That was 1969, yeah.
Well, and also 2003. There was a black cat in that same Bartman game.
Why didn't they just kill it right then? That probably would have saved everything.
Probably, but we wouldn't have had this great narrative in 2016.
Or a black cat. Let's see. Who's your number 1?
My number 1 is Sidney Crosby's golden goal, Canada beating U.S. in Olympic hockey in 2010.
Yeah, see, that should not be number 1 because that's countryism you're pulling on me there.
Well, you just said a few moments ago you'd put the Miracle on Ice 1980.
Well, yeah, that was a lot bigger deal, though, because we were beating godless communists. Do you guys really hate us as much as we hated godless communists?
No, but if I
Okay.
may explain the context. So I think what makes this moment significant is in 2006 Olympics, we lose in Torino and get embarrassed. It was an older team. Wayne Gretzky was still the general manager, and Hockey Canada decided to do a whole overhaul of the Olympic program. They brought Steve Yzerman in as the team's general manager, Mike Babcock as the coach. And I think what was just so brilliant about this is this Olympics occurred on our home soil in Vancouver. And for many of us, of course, we remember 2002 in Salt Lake City, but for a young person like me, this is the first time in my lifetime that our country is hosting the Olympics, and especially the Winter Olympics where Canada normally does pretty well. But like you said, Mike, we lose to the Americans 5-3 in the group stage. A lot of buzz starting to circulate in Canada media. Is this team for real? Mike Babcock decides to make a goalie change between Martin Brodeur, who many people consider to be the best goalie of all time, and swaps him in for Roberto Luongo, who's a young goalie, not as experienced. But Luongo does it. He then leads the team all the way to the gold medal game against the U.S. And that game is one of the best hockey games I've ever seen. To have so much firepower on both teams, Canada, United States, playing on our home ice. Of course, the Americans tie it with 9 seconds of the third period to send it to overtime. I remember I was in my house. We were watching the game up in our living room, and then my dad and I went into the basement to try to change the luck around because we wanted to see our Canadians win. And for Sidney Crosby, who was probably the best player in hockey at that time, he had a struggling Olympics. He then was able to then score the golden goal after a pass from McGinley in the corner, fires it past Ryan Miller, the goalie for the Americans, and all of Canada just goes crazy. And I think this moment for me is more than sport because I think that was the first time, well before the Raptors or anything else, where not since the Summit Series, our country really came together to watch and support this team and to watch the gold medal game. I think it is still the most viewed hockey game in Canada as a country. And I think it then set forth a path of Canadian dominance on the international stage. They won gold in Sochi in 2014. They won the World Cup of Hockey in 2016. And without any NHL players in the 2018 Olympics in Korea, and probably not for the distant future, given how NHL is towards the Olympics, we yearn for moments like 2010 where both countries really came together, and it was just such an impactful moment that I think was bigger than sport, just to see what this team was able to do and on our home soil. So to me, that was in 2010, and you put that moment in any decade, and it would be the top moment of the decade for me. So that's my number one.
Yeah, and like I said, people forget the U.S. wins the regular game with Canada, and then the U.S. looked damn near unbeatable when they beat Finland 6-1 because Finland was a team
for sure
I was worried about playing because Finland was one of the best teams in the world also, and to watch the U.S. just take them apart 6-1, it had to make you wonder if Canada could hang with them or not.
Absolutely, and the Americans had a lot of talent, and that game was just played at such high level, Mike, and I haven't really seen a hockey game like that played at that high level. And next to the Stanley Cup, the Olympic gold medal is the most important hockey achievement. And for these Canadians, with the pressure they have on home soil to capture gold, I just think put a bow on what was an incredible Olympic Games for our country.
Well, how about this? I would say up until the early 90s, The Olympic gold medal was a lot bigger deal than what the Stanley Cup was.
Probably,
And then the
probably,
importance,
given,
yeah, the importance of the Olympics is not what it used to be.
I think it depends on the sport, Mike, for sure. I think Olympic hockey now is in a phase where I think it needs the NHL there to reignite that popularity. I think, to me, having, just AHL players representing Team Canada, I don't think does that sport justice. I think it should either go back to what it was in 1980, where you have junior players representing. Because
But we can't get the
junior
Russians to go back to
hockey,
being communist, can we? Or the Czechoslovakians?
no, of
That's what
course.
made it great, though. That was kind of us
Well,
against them, and now we're all just
no,
kind
I
of the
get that.
same. Yeah, I mean, I
No,
think
I get that. I get
Yeah.
that. But I do think that in addition, but I think as well, having the best players in the world also make it greater. I don't
Oh yeah,
think we need a geopolitical conflict to precursor
yeah we
great
do.
talent on the
I
ice.
love conflict. I gotta hate
Well, I
you
know
to
you
make it
do, but
exciting. Yeah.
well, I think there was hate between Canada and the U.S. Certainly in
Oh,
2010.
I no, there
I
wasn't. There's no Americans that hate
I think there
Canadians. You
was.
may all hate us, but we just look at you as like our northern state that's never been declared.
Well, I think some people don't even know what Canada is.
Well,
So
no,
where you're,
some people think that it's the northern state that just doesn't have a star yet.
yeah,
I'm serious.
manifest
There's some
destiny.
not very
Anyway,
bright people, especially if you go to like Kentucky and places like that.
Mike, what's
What?
your number one?
Oh, I don't know. My number one is the death of Muhammad Ali
Mm,
because I think he is the most iconic sports figure in history. I think he is the most well known, and Muhammad Ali, like I said, the most well known the world over. This is a man who won Olympic gold. The story there was he goes back to Louisville and still has to drink from a separate water fountain, still gets called the N word, and in despair on a bridge at Kentucky, just throws the gold medal into the bridge because he thought if my own country could care less about me, why does this medal mean anything? He goes on to become the heavyweight champion of the world with a huge upset over Sonny Liston, who was considered invincible. After that, he changes his name to Muhammad Ali, and basically pisses most of America off, black and white at the point. He's following Malcolm X, Louis Farrakhan, guys like this. And then about 1965, 66, as Vietnam's ramping up into 67, he decides that he's not going to enlist in the military, which is a huge moment, I think, because there were people that protested the Vietnam War. But Muhammad Ali really brought to the forefront why this war was so wrong. And the sad thing is, he started off fighting by himself, and he refuses induction into the military. He gets suspended basically 3 years, which is 1,300 days. And I still have this argument with people where they say he was a draft dodger. He was not a draft dodger. He didn't run to Canada. He didn't go hide. He stood there and said he would take his punishment. And it took 1,300 days, and he basically beat the United States government, and he was a conscientious objector. He was not a draft dodger. He didn't believe in war under any circumstance unless you were defending himself. And I think what he said and what pissed off a lot of white America was, he didn't have no quarrels, no Viet Cong, because they never enslaved him. And when you look forward to that, he takes 1,300 days off, and when he comes back after 3 years off, he fights one of the top 5 contenders in Jerry Quarry, knocks him out in 3 rounds, fights Oscar Bonavena, who's a man who had already fought Joe Frazier, knocked Joe Frazier down twice in the first 2 rounds and lost a close decision. He beats him by stopping him in the 15th round. And then you get Ali Frazier 1, which I think is still the most iconic sporting event in history. I mean, and this was a black versus white thing. This is like a Holmes Cooney thing because white people, wanted Joe Frazier. Black people wanted Muhammad Ali, and the black people, for the most part, called Joe Frazier and Uncle Tom just like Ali did. And they waged an epic battle at Madison Square Garden, which if you watch it, then when you watch Deontay Wilder fight anybody, you'll just want to gouge your own eyes out. Because these were two men that were willing to die in a ring. And he loses that fight. Loses to Kenny Norton where he gets his jaw broken, still continues to fight. And then he fights George Foreman in Zaire in one of the great upsets in sports history. A lot of people feared for his life. I mean, I've seen an interview of Howard Cosell where Howard Cosell said he feared for his life. And Ali beats Foreman. He fights Frazier again in a Thrill of Manila, wins that. And the thing that made Ali special was he was actually probably the last guy that was the heavyweight champion of the world. I mean, he was an ambassador. He fought on 4 continents during his career. He fought in Europe, visited Asia, Africa later in his career. Never lost a fight away from the U.S. until his last fight in the Bahamas against Trevor Berbick. And he, like I said, he was an ambassador for the sport and for what he believed in. And he paid a steep price for one international outing, which I think was the downfall of him, where he took on Antonio Inoki in 1976. Now, Inoki was a martial artist expert and a wrestler. And if you watch that fight, or if you can call it a fight, he basically laid on his back and kicked at Ali the entire fight. And Ali repeatedly would try to get to him. He'd kick Ali in the legs. And Ali ended up with blood clots. And after that, lost most of his mobility in the ring. And then he loses to a young Leon Spinks in only his 7th or 8th pro fight. Comes back, beats him. But when you look at this, the Iranian hostage crisis, 1979 or 1980, Muhammad Ali was there. Ali got in Lebanon, got hostages out. I mean, Muhammad Ali is a man that stood for everything. Everything he believed in, he would stand up for, and he would take the consequences. And I know he ended up with Parkinson's, but I've also seen interviews with him in the mid-late 80s when you could still understand him. And he said, why would I change my life? He said, my first 35, 40 years of my life, I did a million times more than almost anybody else ever could have. And the thing that stands out here is half of America hated him in the mid to late 60s into the early 70s. But by the time he died, all of America loved him because they understood what he was.
Yeah.
He was Colin Kaepernick with more of a backbone. And I hate to say that because I respect what Colin Kaepernick did. But the things that have happened since make you think a little less of Colin Kaepernick. Muhammad Ali never backed down from anything, whether it was in the ring or outside of the ring, or basically Parkinson's and, a bad thyroid and everything else in his life. Now, the man was not perfect. There's only been one person I know of to walk this earth that was perfect, and his name's not Muhammad Ali. I don't agree with Muhammad Ali's religious views. I don't agree with a lot of things he said. But one thing I do admire most about anybody is having the convictions to stand up for what you believe in. If you're willing to do that, I don't really care what you believe in. I'm good with it.
He certainly had the courage of his convictions. And, I remember when he passed away and, very, very sad day. And, I think you hit the nail on the head, Mike. Like, I know sports shows across America were revering him, praising him, really memorializing him. But this is the same country that shunned him in the 60s and the 70s.
Well, not the country didn't shun him. Part of the country shunned him. But I know this. My dad, who was in the military in the mid-60s, his favorite story was Muhammad Ali fighting Karl Mildenberger in Germany, and what a big deal it was. And my dad absolutely loved Muhammad Ali, and he served in the military. He was a Republican, but he loved Ali. And his thing was this. He says, yeah, he runs his mouth, but he's the only guy you've ever seen that runs his mouth and backs it up every time. And, when you look at a guy like that, I mean, that says a lot about a man because there's very few people that can back up their words. And I remember 1978. this is the first time I really, even though I lived in Indiana, and there was no black people in the town I lived in, no black people in school with me. But in 1978, when Ali lost to Leon Spinks, I remember going across the street to my friend's house, and his dad was all happy. It was the day after Ali and Spinks' first fight. And I said, "What are you so happy about?" He said, "Because that N word finally got his ass kicked." And I was so pissed off. And I go back and I tell my dad. And my dad looked at me and he said, "Son," he said, "it's better to know what you're dealing with than for them to be quiet." He said, "Just ignore him." But I know this. And we had moved between the first fight and the second fight because my dad had built us a house. And we lived probably about 10 miles from there. But I know this. We were at the pool in September because school didn't start till like the middle of September back then, believe it or not. And Ollie had just beat Spinks. And here he comes walking with his sons. And I just looked at him and smiled. And you know what he said to me? He said, "It doesn't matter. He's still the N-word." But that dude's on the school board now. But
but yeah, no, Mike. I mean, yeah, and I really applaud you for putting that at number one. It certainly was.
Well, how about this, Lucas? Moment. He is the athlete that had the most effect on me growing up.
Oh yeah.
I mean, he's the guy that, to this day, if you say like Ali Shavers, I can tell you exactly where I was watching the fight at, what was happening with my parents, what was happening everywhere. Same thing, Ali Spinks too, Ali Young. Now, I don't remember anything really before 1975, but all his fights from Ron Lyle, Jimmy Young on up, I remember all that. And the effect it has was my mom and sister were not huge boxing fans, and I'm sure you've heard this story before, but the night he lost to Larry Holmes, we're watching it in a living room on something called On TV because it was only closed circuit. On TV was this little box where, you could get stuff like that. And I remember walking in my room because my dad had a bunch of his friends over, and my sister and my mom were in there watching the fight, and the fight had ended, and Ali was beaten badly by Holmes, and my mom and my sister, who were not boxing fans, were both sitting on my bed in tears. I mean, there's no athlete that has that effect. Tiger Woods doesn't have that effect. Tiger Woods' effect is he's a really great player. That's what most of these guys are. They're just really great players. There's very few athletes that transcend sports.
For sure.
Yeah, and the thing is this. When's the last time we had an athlete that transcended sports?
Not many.
I mean, Michael Jordan? Larry
Probably,
Bird?
maybe, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, when you get into the 80s...
LeBron James, maybe.
I don't think he does, though, because this is the thing, though. I mean, I don't really think Michael Jordan transcended it like Ali, because there's a lot of people that dislike Michael Jordan because they think he's a bad person.
Well, I think LeBron has done a lot of off-the-court stuff. He's built his own school. He's now not at the extent from an international perspective like Muhammad Ali did. But I think, that is a ceiling that probably will never be met again.
And
I just don't. Yeah, go ahead.
My point to that is I don't think it can. And I don't think guys like Babe Ruth, Red Grange, Jack Dempsey, Joe Louis, I don't think it can because, and I've said this before, they were mythical figures because a lot of times you couldn't see the fight. You couldn't see the baseball game. And you had writers like Grantland Rice back in the old days, almost 100 years, that would write about these guys, and you would have this larger-than-life thing. And the only thing you knew about Jack Dempsey or Babe Ruth is what was written about him. And who wrote about the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse with Notre Dame? I mean, Newt Rockne. You didn't get to see this. I mean, to watch Newt Rockne's team play, you had to be one of the people in that building at the time they were playing. Other than that, you just read about him.
Yeah.
And Muhammad Ali had scars. He had things that he did that, nobody would be proud of. And, he had 3 wives. But the thing is this, that was not pushed back then. What was pushed was the mythical figure. Now, the thing about Ali, though, is you did have TV back then, so people did know a little bit about that, but he transcended that even. But the question is, if Muhammad Ali existed today, would those little zits end up engulfing him and destroying that myth?
Well, it's a very interesting question.
Because I think it would have. And also today, I mean, what's he going to do? Stand up against going into Iraq? I mean, the thing is this. It's just like Joe Louis against Max Schmeling. We've talked about that. That was the perfect fight at the perfect time. The sporting event was the perfect, There could never be another Red Grange that saves the NFL by selling out stadiums right before teams, go bankrupt. I mean, that's what makes these guys mythical, and we live in a world now where everything's seen all the time. Whether it's good or it's bad, we see it. So if LeBron James does something bad, we see it. Even Michael Jordan, you couldn't see every Michael Jordan game in 1987. Not even if you lived in Chicago, because the home games are blacked out probably.
Mm-hmm.
And they're not showing the game in Sacramento. And I just think that I think the way the world is and technology has kind of taken away from sports being able to have mythical figures.
Well, I think it also takes away from people enjoying the moments. I think we're so obsessed with, the technology and, being tapped into our phones. And, I made the point to you, Mike, last week when we talked about the Raptors, how when I went to the parade, I made it a point of just, putting my phone away just to take everything in. And I think we don't do that enough because we're so focused on our phones and the Twitter and trades and this that we don't really watch the games anymore. We don't really take in and embrace those moments like we mentioned in this top 10 and even other moments that weren't mentioned. Like I can think of right now, we had 2 Triple Crown horse race winners in this decade. Like we had other great moments that I think going forward in the next decade, I think people just need to really, take a step back and, take and appreciate the moments that are being brought in front of you because some, they may never happen again, right? Like, the Raptors, who knows how long it might be. The Cubs, for heaven's sakes, it took 100 years before, the Cubs won a World Series. It took so long for a Triple Crown winner to finally happen.
Well, how about this, Lucas? You ever been at a concert and, somebody's favorite song comes on and all of a sudden they're looking at that song and listening to it while trying to film it? And that always blew my mind. You're actually missing the moment where they're playing your favorite song live just so you can go back and watch it on your little, 7-inch phone or whatever the hell it is later on. And that just...
And I'll tell you this, Mike. The people who take those photos, chances are they don't go back to watch those videos because they're occupied on something else. And then they're occupied on the next thing. And I would rather have a moment where you were in that concert, you were at that parade, you were at that game, you were watching a game, and you can just remember it without needing a technology device to bring you back. Because ultimately, a photo or a video won't do justice to the moment that you felt or the emotions that you felt in that moment.
Yeah, because the photo should be in your mind.
And
you know what I mean?
Exactly.
It's like what I talk about. I remember exactly where I was, 1977 when Ali beat Shavers. I remember what was going on. That picture is forever in my mind until I'm no longer here. Now, if I'd have been just, walking around with a camera snapping pictures, I wouldn't remember it because that moment wouldn't be that big a deal if I'm thinking, hey, I got to take a picture of this.
For sure.
But, all right,
and,
Lucas.
But
go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say it was A very interesting decade in sports. A lot of good moments, and it was great to talk about them with you, Mike.
Yeah, as always, it was great to have you on, Lucas. As soon as I get off here, I'm going to go back and edit that one part I screwed up right in the middle of the show, or right around number 3, so nobody will ever hear it again. But I want to thank you for coming on. You want to tell people where they can follow you on social media and find you?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm on Twitter at Weese Sports. That is at WEESE Sports, where I do a lot of tweeting of a variety of different sports. So, yeah, that's where you can find me.
So make sure you check him out. You can find us at Grueling Truth. You can hear us on any podcasting platform you might like, including Spotify, iHeartRadio, iTunes. But I don't know why I said that, because I'd already told you we're everywhere. So just go ahead and get out there, check us out. And for now, we're going to go ahead and wrap the show up. I want to thank Lucas for coming on. I want to thank everybody for listening. So for Lukas Weese, I'm Mike Goodpaster. You've been listening to The Grueling Truth, where the legends speak.